Hello, my name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist, and for a long time I've been interested in how psychology and spirituality connect. Sometimes these two fields have kept their distance from each other, but in my experience, they really belong together and complement each other. Good psychological insight can be a support and strength in our spiritual lives, and a healthy, grounded spirituality can bring greater meaning, resilience, and balance to everyday life. In this podcast, I offer a short weekly reflection on the gospel for the coming week. It's meant to be helpful for those preparing homilies, but also for anyone who wants to engage more deeply with the scriptures, whether you're teaching, studying, or simply reflecting in your own prayer life. I also invite my listeners to listen to previous editions of this podcast. I draw on psychology, spiritual scholarship, and anthropology to make the gospel feel accessible and relevant and enriched. Scripture isn't just about belief. It also speaks to what it means to be human. Even though the biblical writers lived in a very different world, their insights still shed light on questions we all wrestle with today: who we are, why we suffer, and where will we find hope. Today's podcast focuses on the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 to 33. It will be read in churches on August the 9th, 2026. This Gospel is unusual. The Gospel focuses on Jesus walking on water, and when asked by the disciple Peter, Jesus invites Peter to walk on water with him. There is no other Gospel like this. There are two other Gospels that are very unusual too. We have the account of the Transfiguration from Matthew chapter 17, verse 1 to 9, and the story about paying the temple tax, where Jesus is asked to pay a temple tax, and he instructs Peter to go out fishing for him. And Peter catches a fish with a coin in his mouth. Matthew chapter 17, verse 24 to 27. I am not sure I could write a homily on that gospel. It may not mean anything, but I notice that the disciple Peter is involved in all three of the unusual gospel experiences. I would like to focus your attention on the dialogue between Peter and Jesus. Peter asks if he can come to him. Jesus says yes, and Peter jumps out, but fear gets to him and he starts to sink. Notice that Jesus does not comment on Peter's fear, but rather on his lack of faith. In fairness to Peter, he did have the faith to jump out of the boat. I don't see any of the other disciples willing to do that. His experience serves as a model for all Christians who desire to follow Jesus but are confronted with fear. I have spoken about fear before. Please check out the edition of this podcast published on June the 14th, 2026, and another June 16th, 2024, for additional insights on this theme. Fear is paralyzing and can often lead to behavior that is destructive to the individual or to others. Fear can prevent both psychological and spiritual growth. There's an interesting trend emerging in recent research and the media that reports a noticeable, though still debated, rise in young people, particularly Gen Z and millennials, returning to the church. It's not uniform across countries or denominations, but enough data is accumulating that it's worth paying attention to as we explore what might be driving it. To understand this movement, we have to start with the broader cultural context shaping this generation. Lydia Gilbertson, a Gen Z writer, captures it well. She describes her peers as growing up in the shadow of multiple overlapping pressures: the global pandemic, climate anxiety, rising cost of living, and what we are calling a mental health crisis. It's within this convergence that Gen Z is increasingly been labeled the anxious generation. And that label isn't just rhetorical. Many young people today experience the world as fundamentally unstable, even unsafe. There's a sense that the structures that we were supposed to provide guidance and security, leadership, institutions, systems, have in various ways failed. The result is growing distrust, coupled with real concerns about economic futures, social justice, and whether long-term stability is even attainable. Psychologically, the impact has been significant. We are seeing rising rates of anxiety and depression, compounded by loneliness, disrupted developmental milestones, and a pervasive uncertainty about the future. In that kind of environment, the question just isn't what do I do? It becomes, what can I trust? Or even, what gives life meaning to it all? And there's where another layer of the story begins to emerge. In the interviews and reporting, Sky News, for example, states that young people themselves are voicing something deeper. Alongside the anxiety, there's the growing recognition of what they've often described as the brokenness of the world. There's a sense that things are not as they should be. And, importantly, this generation doesn't seem to shy away from that realization, and they are willing to ask hard questions about meaning, justice, and purpose. One young believer put it simply, "There's so much negativity in the world that people are starting to long for something more, for purpose, for fulfillment. So while Gen Z may be cautious about institutions, including the church, they are not disengaged spiritually. In many ways, they are searching, actively and honestly." This aligns with the broader research, including analysis of Tom Rainier's work, which compiles extensive data on this very phenomena. The conclusion is not that the church has changed its mission, but that the conditions on which young people encounter it have shifted dramatically. Anxiety and instability and cultural upheaval are no longer background factors. They are central drivers shaping how and why young people engage in faith. Church leaders are noticing this as well. The author and speaker Kerry Nimfov, reflecting on recent data, points to what he calls a growing mental health crisis among members of Gen Z cohort. He suggests that the digital life, especially increasing mediated or artificial forms of connection, i.e. cell phones, internet, may actually be intensifying loneliness rather than alleviating it. And in that context, the church begins to be seen differently, not just as a place of belief, but as a place of belonging, as a kind of counter space to isolation. He even frames it this way, the church as an antidote to loneliness. Now, whether or not one fully agrees with that framing, it does reflect something important that leaders are hearing consistently, that for many young people, the wider world seems emotionally unsafe, fragmented, even empty. And in contrast, the church, at least at its best, is experienced as something more grounded, more relational, more real. So, when you step back and look at the larger picture, a few threads begin to come together. There's a heightened sense that the world is unstable, even untrustworthy, contributing to anxiety and hypervigilance. There's a growing awareness of moral and existential brokenness, which leads to deeper questioning about meaning and hope. And there's a kind of saturation of negativity that paradoxically awakens a longing, purpose, for coherence, for something that holds. In that sense, what we are seeing may not simply be a return to church. It may be something more fundamental, an attempt to find a container, psychologically and spiritually, for the weight this generation is carrying. And that raises an important question for all of us. If young people are coming not just with curiosity, but with anxiety, distrust, and longing, how is the church prepared to meet them? I wonder if people coming to faith because of fear is healthy. I realized that approximately 30 times in the Gospels, the conversations start with some variation of the words, "Do not be afraid." To give you examples, the angel Gabriel said to Mary at the Annunciation, "Do not be afraid, Mary." We read in Luke chapter 1, verse 30. At the birth of Jesus, the angels announced to the shepherds, "Do not be afraid, I bring you good news." We read this in Luke chapter 2, verse 10. To the women at the tomb, the angel said, "Do not be afraid." We read this in Matthew chapter 28, verse 5, Mark 16, verse 6, and Luke chapter 24, verse 5. To the disciples in the storm, Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." This is found in Matthew chapter 14, verse 27, Mark chapter 6, verse 50, and also in John chapter 6, verse 20. To the disciples after the resurrection, peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Found in John chapter 20, verse 19 to 21. One's Christian faith can function as a source of courage in the presence of fear. However, when faith is predominantly organized around fear, it exhibits important limitations. As previously discussed, fear can inhibit adaptive function, constrict cognitive flexibility, and lead individuals to fixate on a singular perceived solution while neglecting viable alternatives. In more extreme cases, fear may contribute to dysregulated or aggressive responses. Fear has also significant implications for spiritual formation. It is therefore important to consider the underlying motivations for one's Christian identity. If one's primary motivation is the attainment of salvation, this is both understandable and theologically consistent. However, when this remains the sole or dominant focus, spiritual development may be constrained. Likewise, if engagement in Christian practices is primarily orientated towards self-enhancement for the pursuit of positive effect, the depth and maturity of one's spirituality are unlikely to progress. It is therefore understandable that Jesus would challenge Peter's faith in the moments where fear has become evident. From both a psychological and spiritual perspective, it is prudent to reflect on the presence of fear in one's life and to examine how these fears may shape behavior, perception, and spiritual development. Thank you for joining me at this time. If this podcast has been meaningful to you, I invite you to tune in each week. Your questions and reflections are always welcome. I encourage you to share your episodes with others who maybe find them helpful. If you are listening on YouTube, you can support this podcast by subscribing. It's free. It helps the podcast become more available in search engines. Please consider leaving a review. I appreciate the feedback. I also appreciate hearing where you're coming from and listening from, In a special way, I'd like to do a shout out to my listeners in Madrid, Spain. Thank you for joining me. Next Sunday, August the 16th, 2026, we will hear from Matthew chapter 15, verse 21 to 28, and we'll be able to reflect on the conversation between Jesus and an unnamed Canaanite woman. She is seeking relief for her daughter. It becomes very clear this woman has a greater understanding of the mission of Jesus than his disciples and most of the people Jesus has been teaching. Because of her advanced understanding, she can challenge Jesus and the Judaic understanding of the mission of the Messiah. Jesus is clearly impressed, and his answer is valuable for all Christians, regardless of their background. New episodes are released every Sunday and focus on the upcoming gospel. Special thanks to Heather Patel Doherty and Ritu Colomb for their continued support and review. May God bless you all this week.